Did you know 2 out of 3 murder victims are killed by someone they know? That's roughly around 60 to 70% of victims. For Fallon Fridley, she was just 2 years old when her life was taken from her by someone she knew, her own babysitter. December 9th, 2020 was a normal day for the family. Fallon was being babysat by Kirstie Flood. She was a family friend, and she was someone that Kris, who was Fallon's mom, had known for the last few years. She had deeply trusted her with her entire life. And Kirstie had been there when she was in a really dark place in her life. And she was so close to her that Kirstie was now babysitting Fallon. And on top of this, Kirstie also had her own kids, and one of them was Harper, who was Fallon's best friend. This was kind of like any other situation where two moms are really close friends and they also have kids who are really close friends. It was the perfect situation. In the evening of December 9th, Kris would get a call telling her that Fallon had fallen off a slide and she needed to get down to the hospital because it was critical. The next few hours were agonizing for Kris. She was waiting at the hospital with her husband and her mother and a few family members, waiting for the doctors just to tell her anything about Fallon. She wasn't even allowed to see Fallon at all. They wouldn't give her any information, but they kept asking her what happened, and Kris literally did not know. When Kris was finally allowed in the PICU, she was able to see her daughter Fallon, but there would be doctors and nurses surrounding Fallon, trying to get her heart to beat. But eventually, they would have to call it. Fallon would die at 1:18 a.m., December 10th, 2020. As Kris held her baby girl in her arms, this little bundle of happiness and joy was just now covered in bruises. And Kris would apologize, telling her daughter, I'm sorry. But then she felt something. She felt a baseball-sized knot in the back of Fallon's skull. Fallon didn't fall off a slide, because you don't end up with a fractured skull, a stomach full of blood, a ruptured spleen, liver, and colon. That is something that is deliberately done to you. And these injuries were acute, meaning they were recent, within the last couple hours, and she had been with Kirstie. How does a toddler who has been babysat by someone for months end up murdered? But first, let me welcome you to the Decomposing Flower podcast. I'm your host, Jen. With me is Kira. In this podcast, if you're new here, we talk about all things that are true crime adjacent. So if that is anything you're interested in, stay around. I will say this episode will have themes around child abuse and, of course, child death. So if any of that is too much for you, I totally understand. You can check out another episode or maybe just watch something that makes you relax. The world has really gone to shit lately, so I don't blame you. Before I continue, I do want to say that if you're watching this on YouTube, there will not be any footage of Fallon's last moments. They are on the internet from what I know, but I do know that Kris has been asking people to take it down or report it because it was never supposed to be in the public. And of course, I want to honor her wishes, so that won't be in this episode. I also want to say I am not speaking for anybody in this case, but some conversations or situations will be paraphrased unless I give you a direct quote. All this information is found online. If you're curious, you can learn more about Kris and Fallon through her socials, which I will have linked down below in the description if you are curious. But with all of that, I think we can start this episode. On September 27th, 2018, Fallon Fridley, who goes by Kris, was just 25 years old when she had a C-section and had given birth to Fallon, who was born 5 days past her due date. Fallon was actually alone during this time. Her family wasn't able to get to her during the time she was giving birth. On top of this, Fallon's biological dad was not the best guy, and he actually was yelling at Fallon through the phone. So clearly not a winner, and that was actually the last time Kris ever spoke to him. But she would end up marrying her husband at the time, Cameron Gant in October of 2020. Even though Fallon was not his biological daughter, he loved her as if she was. She always kind of saw him as her dad, and he treated her like she was his daughter. He actually was her favorite, according to Kris. She was kind of like a daddy's girl, I guess you could say. She really loved Cameron. She actually had said dad to him one day, and it actually just like warmed his heart, which I can imagine when you are dating someone with kids, getting the kids' approval is probably the hardest part. And he won that. Kris actually didn't have it easy. She was a recovering addict, but she did the work, she got herself out, and she got herself in a career working as a vet tech at a no-kill shelter. And so she was just living her life as best as she could, taking care of Fallon and just trying to live this life with Cameron. Fallon was literally the cutest little girl ever. She's like the stereotypical idea you think of a toddler, like these bright blue eyes, these chubby little cheeks. She was happy. She was so cute and fun. She apparently didn't know strangers. The way I kind of see her is that, when you go to like a grocery store and a child just starts talking to you like they know you, that's kind of the vibe I got from Fallon, is that she just was this happy little fun thing full of energy. She loved to sing, and she loved her best friend Harper, and she also loved her kitten, Mr. Butters, which I'm assuming she got this kitten from the shelter that her mom worked at. So Kirstie Flood was the mom of Harper, and she was best friends with Kris all the way back since 2016. And Kirstie was really there for Kris when Kris was in recovery for her addiction. From what I could see and from my research, Kirstie actually helped Kris during this time and was one of Kris's big inspirations of getting help and getting clean and just living her life. So these two were like really close and they really trusted each other. So during 2020, Fallon was in daycare, but of course, COVID happened and her daycare was closed. And at the time, both Kris and Cameron were working and they needed someone that could take care of Fallon. Around this time, Kirstie was struggling with some money. I don't know if she wasn't working because of the pandemic or what was really going on, but she needed some extra cash. And so Kristen thought, why don't you babysit Fallon for a few days out of the week and you can get some extra cash? This was honestly a win-win for everybody because one, Kirstie was going to get around $125 a week. Yeah, it's not a lot, but I mean, it's better than nothing. Fallon was going to be able to see Harper every week. And for Kris, this was going to be a lot cheaper than what she would typically have to pay somebody. And it was someone that she trusted because she wouldn't want someone she didn't know to look after Fallon. But unfortunately, this would be another case of betrayal. Kirstie had been watching Fallon since August of 2020, but this all changed on December 9th, 2020. The day started off super normal. Fallon was dropped off at Kirstie's house around 6 in the morning. Sometime during the day, Kirstie actually texted Kris and said, hey, could Fallon spend the night? They actually had been planning a sleepover for the last couple weeks or so, but Kris was a little nervous because Fallon was just 2 years old. She had never been away from her mom, or at least away from a family member, so this is kind of like a big deal. But they thought, why not? And of course, like for Kris, she didn't have like some sixth sense where she's nervous because some higher being or she just knows the future. She's a first time mom, and I'm sure for many moms, the first sleepover is probably very nerve wracking. But they did agree to it because Fallon actually really loved Kirstie's place. She was the kind of kid when you would pick her up, she didn't want to go home. Kris knew that Fallon would want to spend the night with Harper, and she was going to pick her up the next day anyways, so why not? During the late afternoon, Kris was texting and asking Kirstie how Fallon was doing, but she wasn't really getting an answer. Eventually, Kirstie did get back to her and said that they were just heading to the park, but her phone was about to die, so she would get back to her. So it took a while for Kirstie to kind of get back to Kris multiple times during the day, which was a little odd to Kris because Kirstie was known to get back to Kris all the time. So it was a little weird, but her phone was dying, so maybe she just forgot to charge it. Around 6:30 p.m., Kirstie and Kris would finally get back into contact, and Kris was like, "Hey, can I FaceTime Fallon before she goes to bed just to say goodnight?" Kirstie was like, "Hey, I need to charge my phone. Is it all right if I call you in an hour?" And so Kris said yes. This is already a little weird because I don't think you need to charge your phone while you're FaceTiming, but I have no idea. An hour later, Kris was finally able to FaceTime Fallon, but Fallon wasn't her usual bubbly self. She was really quiet and tired, and the room was dark. Fallon wasn't even that close up to the phone. She was actually like 5 feet away, like sitting on a couch or a bed or something, and wasn't really talking. And Kirstie was like, "Oh, she just woke up from a nap. That's probably why." As Kris was trying to talk to Fallon, she just wasn't really engaging, but she knew that Fallon really loved Cameron, so she said, "Do you want to say goodnight to Daddy?" And Fallon said yes, but in a really quiet and somber tone, just nothing like her. And right when they were about to have these conversations, the FaceTime just ended. And so Kris texted Kirstie and was like, "Hey, did your phone die?" And Kirstie would eventually get back to her and say yes. At this point, this actually really rubbed Cameron the wrong way. He was really put off. He was actually the one who did suggest maybe we should go and pick Fallon up. Something just doesn't feel right. But Kris, I think maybe she didn't want to be that mom. She was the one who said, "No, I think it's fine." Now, I do want to pause here for a second. Kris has been victim blamed a lot in this case. There's been a lot of comments that blame her for this, but she didn't do anything wrong. She trusted her best friend. I don't think she did anything wrong. And I think it's just like crazy that people are gonna blame her. I also know that Kris really has a lot of regret for saying, "No, it's fine. We don't need to get her." But I think for a lot of moms, you're told that you're overreacting. Even women were told we're overreacting. And so maybe Kris didn't think anything of it. And also, it's not like she was going to be thinking, "Oh, maybe Fallon's not talking because my best friend of 4 years just did something to my daughter." Like, she's not thinking that. So I just think comments like that are just so unhelpful and just dumb. But basically, Kris did end up trying to call Kirstie back, but she ended up having to call Jeff, who was Kirstie's boyfriend at the time, and that's when she found out that Kirstie's phone had died. In 30 minutes, her entire life would transform and change. 911 would get a call roughly around 8:40 p.m. from Jeff's phone, saying they had an unresponsive toddler and that they needed an ambulance. The operator did explain how to do CPR on Fallon because obviously there is a specific way you have to do it on a toddler. By the time EMS did arrive, they were attending to Fallon, trying to get her to breathe, but nothing was really working. At this point, Kirstie was trying to explain that Fallon fell off a slide at the park and that she was acting fine, she was okay, and that she didn't know what was going on with her, but that she just started to kind of act a little weird. Eventually, Kris would get a call from Kirstie and she was hysterical. She was crying, telling her that she needed to come pick Fallon up. She needed to come over because Fallon wasn't waking up. She wasn't breathing. Kris at this time could not even understand what Kirstie was saying because she was so hysterical. One of the officers was able to take the phone and would tell Kris that she needed to get down to the Scottish Rite Children's Hospital because Fallon was there and she was in critical condition. I can't imagine being Kris in this moment, having your daughter go to her very first sleepover and you get a call that your daughter's in critical condition and you had just were on FaceTime with her. I just can't imagine. So Kris, Cameron, and a few other family members would end up going to the hospital and they were kind of put in a room while they were waiting. They were anxious because obviously they don't know what's going on. No one is telling them shit. The only thing Kris knew is that Fallon fell off a slide. But the doctors kept coming in and asking her, "What happened to Fallon? What's going on? What happened to your daughter?" Most likely, the doctors and the nurses probably suspected that Kris did something because they probably didn't know that she was with Kirstie at the time. Because obviously, Fallon was in such critical condition that this isn't just an accident, this is deliberate. So they didn't know who did this to her. And at the time, Kris didn't know how serious this was. She kept being told that Fallon was stable, but critical. And of course, she's not hearing critical, she's hearing stable, which I don't blame her because that's what I would think too. Kris actually said she started to get really aggressive with the doctors because she's like, I want to see Fallon. Why is no one showing me Fallon? And then even the chaplain showed up. And of course, this upset her more. Nobody really wants to see the chaplain or have someone there to kind of give you support, like a religious leader, because that's usually like the signs of, oh, now you got to pray to God, right? And she actually was really upset seeing him because she was in complete denial. And I don't blame her for that. But she would finally be brought up to the PICU and she would just see Fallon wrapped up in tubes with a bunch of nurses and doctors hovering over her, trying to get her to breathe and trying to get her heart to beat. Kris would beg them over and over to please save Fallon. These doctors would look at this parent begging and they would continue. But eventually, the window for Fallon was closing, and they told Kristen, if her heart doesn't start beating, we're going to have to call it because this is causing more damage than good to Fallon. And eventually, they would have to call it. On December 10th, 2020, at 1:18 a.m., Fallon died surrounded by doctors, nurses, tubes, and her family. At first, the nurses didn't want to hand Fallon over to Kris, not because they didn't want Kris to hold her, but because they knew that she would feel that giant baseball-sized knot at the back of her skull. You have to remember, she's 2 years old. That is massive. I mean, that's massive on anyone, but like a toddler, that's huge. So the nurses would hand over Fallon to Kris, and Kris would cradle her, crying, apologizing to Fallon, telling her she was sorry. But as she was cradling her, that's when she would feel that giant knot. And she was confused. And so were the doctors and the investigators and the police and everyone else. Because how does a little girl go for a sleepover, fall off a slide, and end up with a fractured skull, a ruptured liver, spleen, and colon, a stomach full of blood, and on top of this, to make it worse, she had been essayed. So what the fuck happened, and where was Kirstie, the babysitter? Because the entire time, Kirstie was not at the hospital. She stayed back at her house. She didn't show up. I don't know about you, but if my friend's child was in the hospital, I would be there sitting with her, especially if I was the one who babysat her, unless Kirstie had something to hide. So obviously, Kirstie was one of the prime suspects. She was actually first interviewed, and she was interviewed and not interrogated. So those are two different things. She wasn't read her Miranda rights. It was more so like to gather questions. When she first showed up, she was asking how was Fallon, and at this point, Fallon had, of course, died, but the interrogators kind of didn't want to tell her that because they knew that if they told her that she died, she might not be as willing to tell them everything. And obviously, if you take murder off the table, it's going to be better, or someone might be more willing to explain what happened. So they would actually just kind of tell her, oh, like Fallon is in critical care. And Kirstie would constantly be like, is she okay?
She's okay. I mean, she's not doing okay, but she's still at the hospital. She's okay. Like I said, well, she's not doing good. But she couldn't be okay. I don't know.
So I'm going to kind of explain what Kirstie's side of the story is. And then as I tell you, I'll kind of get into what actually happened. Kirstie literally blames everyone from her dog to her daughter and even ghosts. So she says Cameron dropped off Fallon around 6 a.m. in the morning, and that Harper and Fallon were playing together in Harper's room for majority of the day. Sometime in the afternoon is when she would end up texting Kris asking for a sleepover and that the girls were really wanting to spend the night together. And so she asked Kris, and Kris said sure. Then they would end up going to the park to play, and that's when Fallon had fallen off the slide. She actually showed the police photos of them at the park, and this was actually probably one of the stupidest things that she could possibly do because the cops were able to clock that Fallon was okay before the park and at the park, but not after the park, When they asked Kirstie about Fallon falling off the slide, if she was okay, that's when Kirstie would say, yeah, like she didn't cry. And this is when she would start to throw a lot of crazy accusations at both Kris and Cameron. She claimed that it was weird that Fallon never cried because children should always cry, and that this was because she was being abused at home. She tried to say that Cameron was abusing Fallon and even tried to insinuate that Cameron had been essaying her, and I want to make it very clear that is not true. I think tried to use this because she knew that the doctors would be able to tell that she had been essayed, and I think she was going to try and throw Cameron under the bus. She wouldn't directly say that Cameron had been abusing Fallon, but she would say things like, I would never leave my children alone with a man like that who has these crazy charges and his history and that he's been on drugs, which is crazy because one, she's been on drugs and so is her ex-boyfriend or her current boyfriend. I don't know if her and Jeff are still together. So I don't know why she's trying to act like Cameron's this horrible guy when she's also like not a great person either. And I don't know enough about Cameron to say whether he was a good person or not. He is not really that relevant in this case. The only part he really has to play is that he dropped Fallon off and that he was Kris's husband and the stepdad to Fallon. But he's not relevant in her injuries at all. And I do know that Kris and Cameron are no longer together, but this could be as simple as grief. A lot of times when couples or parents end up going through a death of a child, especially as severe as this, usually relationships don't last because grief is really hard to do together. So I don't really know why they split up, and I don't think it's really relevant for this case. But Kirstie would really try to stroke her own ego like she was this great person because she was like, oh, Kris never feeds Fallon healthy food. I do. And then she would go on to say she fed Fallon like cheese puffs because, yeah, that's like the healthiest food ever. She was really trying to act like Kirstie just didn't feed Fallon. She only fed her junk food. Then she tried to say that she was the one who had to bathe Fallon because Kris didn't, and that she even had a bed for Fallon. She was really trying to act like she was this better person. And the way she reminds me of those kinds of people where they kind of help you when you're in a dark place, but then they hold it over your head. And it's almost like it doesn't matter what you do, you can never thank them enough. That's the vibe I get from Kirstie because Kris really loved Kirstie. This was her best friend. I don't know why she had so much against Kris and Cameron. Like, I just don't get it. She also tried to blame Cameron, saying that he got Fallon sick, but this isn't even relevant at all because Fallon didn't die or get injuries due to her being sick. It was from being abused. So she would say that Fallon was fine the entire day, and then roughly around 8 p.m., they had dinner, but then Fallon wouldn't eat, and then she started to act really weird. She was going on that Fallon's eyes were moving left to right, almost as if she had a brain injury, and that she and also Jeff thought it was really weird. And they also heard some like gurgling sounds coming from Fallon, but they decided to put her to bed and go and have a smoke, which is crazy. Roughly around after they started smoking, they went back inside, and Jeff claimed that he was actually really worried for Fallon, so he went and checked on her. And that's when he noticed that Fallon was acting very weird. So, what do? Do they either A, call the police or call an ambulance, B, call Kris, maybe tell Kris, like, hey, your daughter's acting odd, you should come pick her up, or C, maybe take her down to the hospital? Well, actually, they do D. They don't do anything above. They actually place Fallon into a cold bath with her diaper and her socks on, kind of plunging her in and then out because Kirstie basically said that Fallon was acting like she had shell shock, as if she had PTSD. The child is making choking sounds. Their eyes are going wonky. They're not eating. That you're going to plunge them in cold water, like to shock her system. It just did not add up. So the police were like, well, what about her bruises? And Kirstie would say that it was the EMT's fault because they were probably doing CPR wrong. And Kirstie started to play really into this whole, I don't know what happened, this just randomly happened. But a child does not just get severe injuries like this just suddenly. It doesn't just happen randomly. But Kirstie said that she could actually prove she didn't do any of this because she had a home surveillance app, which is called Wise, that recorded everything. And so she goes to show them the recording on her phone, and her phone fucking dies again.
Dude, get this girl a battery pack.
I know, like, I was like, "How many times does your phone die?" So, they're like, "Well, don't worry, we have a charger." And so while her phone is charging, the detectives start to kinda become more annoyed with Kirstie, and they kinda hone in. For the first part, they're a lot more receptive to her, and they're talking to her like she's not the problem. But now they're like, "Okay, you need to stop bullshitting us and tell us what happened because Fallon is not doing well." And again, they're still kind of playing into this idea that Fallon was alive, but she was dead. But that's when they start to say, like, this looks like abuse. And I think the word abuse legitimately triggered Kirstie because she starts to go off the walls. She starts to panic, saying she did nothing wrong, that they were not going to do this to her, that she has kids, that she got her life back in order, that they could not do this to her. But, well, then who did? Was it Jeff? And she's like, no, I didn't do any of this. I don't know what happened. So she starts to get like really creative with what she thinks happens. First, she says that there were people at the park and maybe that they did something to Fallon and she just didn't notice. Then she tries to say that she would have never done anything violent because she's not a violent person. When actually, in a lot of the interrogation, there was a lot of like comments from people and just from my research that showed that she's actually a really violent person. She was known to be quite a physical bully back in middle school. She even had to do counseling on it. So yeah, she is a pretty violent person, but also, girl, no one's going to say they're a violent person while they're being interviewed for an abuse case. You're not going to be like, "Oh yeah, I'm very violent, but I didn't do that." It's just she's dumb. So she then blames Fallon, saying Fallon tripped herself, maybe. Then she actually blames Harper. Yes, her 3-year-old little girl. She blames Harper, saying maybe Harper pushed her down and was dragging her. But the thing that's crazy about this is how strong is your 3-year-old? Because the injuries are so massive, there is no way a 3-year-old could get a fractured skull and a ruptured spleen and a stomach full of blood from a 3-year-old just pushing them down. And also Fallon falling and tripping. How tall is this 2-year-old? Like, this
Yeah,
doesn't make any sense. The distance of her falling is not going to be that far. Yeah, she's fragile because she's a 2-year-old, but still, it was not making sense. So then she says that maybe her dog stepped on Fallon.
buddy.
Yeah,
No.
the detective, I think he's just at his point with her because he's just like straight up like, no, that wouldn't happen. So when she realizes she's not really getting her way and they're not believing her, she starts to just say, well, I should probably get going and go home. I got to pick up my kids. And the interviewers are pretty much like, your phone's charged. Let's check out that app. And she's like, okay. And this is when this bitch gets so creative and so shockingly stupid. So while she's looking at her phone, she's like, oh my God, what is that? That shadow figure. And she literally goes, is that a ghost? Oh my God, did a ghost do this?
Dude, no way.
I can't imagine ever being in a situation where I'm like, oh, I'm no one's believing me. I'm gonna blame a ghost. Your Honor, my client didn't do it. It was a ghost. Like what? What are you talking about? So to summarize, she blamed Kris, she blamed Cameron, she blamed the EMTs, her daughter, people at the park, Fallon herself, her dog, and also a ghost. Oh, and she also blamed her apartment building, like the actual building. She was literally like, the building had a lot of concrete and the vinyl planking was all messed up. So it probably was that she's blaming everybody but herself.
Girl.
Yeah.
At this point, just know you're cooked. Like, be honest with what you fucking did. There's no believing that kind of bullshit.
Right? At that point, you're better off just admitting to it and hoping to have a lesser charge because you didn't lie.
Yeah.
But I mean, just don't do this at all.
Yeah, that's the easy solution. Just don't do it.
Just don't do that. So they end up getting a search warrant for her phone and also for the app. And I also believe her apartment, which she's like, huh? I don't want to do that. So during this moment, they end up leaving. And I think they leave her to either monitor her or they're going to get the warrant. And she's kind of behaving a little bit weird by herself. And I know that a lot of interrogators will do this because usually people can behave a certain way and then once everyone's gone, they'll just kind of not care. She ends up going on her phone and she's texting fast. She also was calling her mom and being like, they're trying to pin this on me. I can't believe this. At this point, they do come back, and that's when they inform her that they do have the search warrant for her phone because they need to see this entire footage. And that's when they let her know that Fallon has died. She definitely does have, I guess, a normal response where she's upset about it. But I feel like she was more upset by the fact that Fallon died because how do you do this to a child and not expect the child to die? And if you didn't expect her to die, did you think that you were just going to drop her off at home and that Kris was just going to be like, oh, like just a couple of bruises? I don't understand this woman. So they try and take her phone away and she starts like quickly like going through her phone. And I think she was trying to delete things and they were like, no, we need your phone. And they just take it from her. She tries to say that she needs her phone because she has an appointment the next day, which they're like, hey, like that's not our problem. You can figure that out yourself.
At this point, girl, you're gonna be canceling any appointments you have for the next, hopefully, rest of your fucking life.
Yeah. So they're able to take her phone. And at this point, they actually did let her go home. Now, I don't exactly know why she was free to go. Maybe they didn't have enough evidence that she did anything. And that's when they would search through her phone. And she was Googling shit like, I hit my child and I feel guilty. What does it mean to have a sudden urge to beat a child that's not yours? What type of people enjoy abusing other people's children? Why do people abuse? If you could not make it more obvious that you did something, that's that. So they were able to get access to the security footage and they were shocked. Now, obviously, I'm not going to be showing the footage, but essentially, she had beat Fallon severely. There was a portion of it that I saw where she kind of picks Fallon up as if she's a rag doll, kind of like the way a child would pick up a toy doll. That's how she's holding Fallon. And obviously, I would not show this, but the video is just astonishing. And it was very clear that Kirstie was the one behind this. And thankfully, I think majority of the footage has been wiped off the internet, but obviously it's the internet and I'm sure it's out there. So if you do see it, please report it because that's what Kris has asked people to do. And Fallon does not deserve to have that footage out there. They knew they needed to arrest Kirstie, so that's when the following day on December 11th, they actually tell her to come down to the station to come pick up her phone. And this girl literally thinks like she's getting away with this. So she comes down to pick up her phone and that's when they sit her in another room and they kind of just like chat with her, ask her a few more questions. And eventually they were able to finally arrest Kirstie and eventually sentenced to life without parole for aggravated sexual assault, tampering with evidence, malice murder and felony murder, child cruelty, and false statements. Jeff was also later arrested in 2021, so the following month. He didn't cause any of the abuse from what the police say, but he also didn't stop Kirstie from doing anything, and he was essentially an accomplice of the murder. So he was only sentenced, though, to 15 years. I feel like he should have gotten way longer, which sucks. But also, Kirstie's own mother was also charged because she got, I don't think she was put in jail or anything, but she was caught coaching Harper on what to say to the detectives.
God.
yeah, like the whole family is a mess. And honestly, the second victim in this case is Harper. She was just 3 years old and she did witness the murder of her best friend. And I do not know what that does to a child. I don't know if she was there witnessing it all or if she had seen parts of it. She was also abused by Kirstie because when they were going through the security footage, they were able to access some of the nanny cams and they were able to see that Harper, and also I think she had like a couple-month-old baby that was also being neglected and abused by Kirstie. So after Kirstie's arrest, DCFS would place Harper into the care of a relative, and this relative said that Kirstie used to call them all the time, but once they started to clock that she wasn't innocent, she just stopped reaching out to them. Kris has actually been a big help for Harper. She raised a lot of awareness and money and a GoFundMe for Harper so that Harper's relatives and also her biological dad could adopt her. And this was raising money for a lot of legal bills and fees and all that. So Harper was cut off from her dad, but he was granted custody of her back in 2021. And from what I can tell, Harper's doing a lot better than she ever has. Harper's got to be around like 10 years old now. So I really, really hope that she's been able to get some form of healing and help because obviously this type of trauma, it does start to show up a lot when you start getting into your preteens. Obviously, I don't know this kid and I don't know if she's showing that, but I just hope that she's able to get the help that she needs. So, a year and a week after Fallon's murder, Kris would actually give birth to her son Asher, and she truly believes that this was a Christmas gift sent from Fallon, and I honestly think that is so precious and just so cute to think of. Kris did not have it easy during this entire case and the last how many years. For years, she was attacked and harassed online by a bunch of trolls, and we know how internet trolls are. They were blaming her. There was also people like indirectly blaming her, saying things like, "This is why I would never leave my kid alone." But Kris didn't do anything wrong. She trusted her friend. She also trusted the babysitter who had been watching Fallon for the last few months, who had a great time there. There was no red flags. And I just think if you're going to blame anyone, blame Kirstie and Jeff. They are the only two people that should be blamed. Kris does share a lot of her story and a lot of what happened to Fallon and just updates on her Facebook page and Instagram called Justice for Fallon, which will all be linked in the description below. I do think that if you have lost a child, that her page would probably be a good help for you because she does talk a lot about that grief and what that's like. And obviously, not a lot of people can relate to this. So it is nice to have a place where maybe if this is something that you relate to in some kind of way to check out. But I do want to share Kris's response to some of the backlash and the criticism and the trolls that she gets on her Facebook. So I'm just going to read a little snippet. I would like for everyone who stumbles across tragedies like mine to think about this next time you say something like that. Think of the shock the victims experience. Think of the horror they are going through and the confusion they are feeling. Think about how I, in that moment, was convinced that none of it had happened. How I thought I was in some sort of sick simulation. Put yourself in the shoes of the victims. Do that just 1 second and then tell yourself that you know exactly what you would do in this sort of scenario. And then thank your God that you never had to do so. I think it's so easy for everybody to just sit there and say, well, I wouldn't have done that. I wouldn't do this. I wouldn't do that. But you don't know that. You don't know in that moment. And Kris said in that moment, she was in denial. She was in shock. She didn't actually think Fallon was in that much critical condition. You can follow more of Kris's journey on her Facebook page, and also the shelter that she works for kids, animals rescue and shelter. They held a ceremony for Fallon in February of 2024 where they created a fountain in memory of Fallon. And I just think it's a really beautiful memory for Fallon and also for Kris to have But I just wanted to end this episode by taking a moment to remember Fallon as this beautiful little girl who had the cutest smile. She was so loved. She had the biggest heart, and that's who she should be remembered for. I also want to take a moment to give my condolences to Kris and her family. I think Kris has gone through so much that most people in their life will never relate to, and I just hope I was able to honor her daughter in the way that she deserves. But that is where we're at for today's episode. Thank you so much for listening. Again, I meant no harm to Fallon or Kris or their family, and I hope I was able to explain this case with as much empathy as I could. If you do have an episode or case you would like us to discuss, you can leave it in the comments below or in our Google form, and we will see you guys next week.